This was a little bit of a difficult game to talk about. The thing I want to start talking about with, based on that premise, based on this request, is actually the aliens in general. I haven't actually done a rumination on the alien movies, and have no current plans to do so. So, this is as good a time to talk about that as anything. One of the things I always found most fascinating about the xenomorph, the alien, the titular alien, is the fact that it is, and I know this is going to sound weird, but bear with me for a moment, alien. It is very alien from us in its motives, in its functionality, in its scruples, in the way it is. It is a very alien thing. It's actually one of the reasons why the film was named that, even though the titular aliens themselves are more commonly referred to as xenomorphs instead. In this case, though, what we have done is we have made a fascinating concept with limited application. This has been my feeling for many years. I can't exactly call myself a fan of the Alien series in the strictest sense of the word, because while I like Alien, and I like Aliens, Aliens being my personal preference actually, I can't list many other things that are specifically of the xenomorphs that I like, because this is my theory, I should say. I think it's because of that limited application, the very few ways in which the aliens themselves can be utilized. We have actually seen two of those major applications already in the movie Alien and in the movie Aliens. And most of the other movies, books, works, comics have tried to follow up on those two ideas. Alien one is fairly simple and obvious when you think about it. Personal, private, very down to earth, very intimate level horror. Specifically suspenseful horror. The kind of horror of you know the thing is nearby and you know what it can do to you. But it's not like, jump scare, jumping out, hitting you with giant amounts of gore and whatnot. That's not the appeal of Alien, at least not to me personally, and not to several people I talked to prior to starting this, since I'm not much of a horror fan in general, and I wanted some outside opinion rather than just jumping into it and talking about it myself in a vacuum of ignorance. So instead, what most of these people tend to like about it is actually, ironically, the same thing I tend to like about it. It's that suspense. It's that atmosphere. It's that quiet knowing. It's the dread. I want to use that word specifically. It's my favorite part of Best of Both Worlds, Part 1. You know who the Borg are. You know what they can do. You know you can't stop them. And it is that quiet, yet omnipresent dread. It's hard to explain, and it's so beautifully atmospheric. The second way these xenomorphs can be applied is the more large-scale action threat, as fully realized with Aliens, or Aliens 2 if you prefer. In other words, in that case, we weren't just fighting the single xenomorph, we were fighting an army of them. There was effectively a giant boss battle between the loader, the power loader, and the queen. And it was kind of awesome, wasn't it? And by kind of, I mean extremely. Especially when you understand the behind-the-scenes stuff that wasn't shown in the original thing. With regards to Ripley's daughter, and the fact that, she had her obvious, mothering tendencies, and, get away from her. All that stuff. It also, I mean, there's some other points that both movies hit, but those are the two applications of the xenomorph. Every other thing has followed those two applications, in some extent or another, including this game. Now, I mention this because I feel this is also one of the reasons why we've seen so few truly good, well, I shouldn't even say truly good, just so few xenomorph things. To make my statement clear, though, because I can already hear you guys rushing to the comment section to say, you're wrong and you're an idiot, Arsh. There's tons and tons of alien stuff. Well, yes and no. Most of the things we see that are not the core movies or the core books or comics are Aliens versus Predator. Or, that's actually I'm going to stop there, because the Aliens versus Predator stuff is way more widespread than the aliens themselves have ever been. And, of course, there's lots and lots of other alien stuff, most of which are also crossovers. In other words, the application is still the same two things. What can we do with the xenomorph? Well, why don't we just introduce a new character to one of those two situations as listed before, one of the two applications of the xenomorph. I personally feel this is one of the reasons why AVP, the Aliens vs. Predator franchise, has flourished much more than just the Aliens franchise in a vacuum. because there's so much more you can do with the dynamic between the predators and the aliens. There's so much more you can do with the interaction of those two and how that affects others. You know, there's more room to work with, in other words. There's more paper on the page, if you will. Now, I'm not trying to disage the xenomorphs. It's an ironic nature of their creation. I liken them to the crystalline entity over on Star Trek. There's really only so much you can do with that story-wise. Basically, really only a couple of things, and ironically, they only did a couple of things with it. But here, well, here we have an itch on the surface of our nose. I hate those itches. You ever have those? Just right on the surface of your nose. I'm going to cut this part out, because that itch is way too much. I think that's a distracting itch. But here, in this particular game, we see the application of both rather well. Obviously, I'm going to be spoiling the hell out of this game, as I always do, but it's always possible that someone who's watching this has not watched my other work, so here's your warning. This Rumination contains many, many spoilers. All the spoilers. Okay? With that said, I wanted to literally leap right into the first spoiler. The fact that the solo encounter with the alien is not the entirety of the game. That's how it was marketed. In fact, they flat out blatantly lied, saying that it would just be you versus the one alien. That is not true. That is about the first half of the game. The second half of the game takes a slightly more action-y take on the aliens, plural. Facehuggers start becoming menace. We see a hive, which is a great scene, by the way. And so we see that this game actually applies both aspects of the alien concept. But I want to talk more about the game's application later. For right now, I'm going to finally pull my notes out here, because I also want to talk about why I think this game succeeded. It succeeded specifically because of the forgot about it effect. That's an unofficial term. I've never really officially called it, even though I've talked about this concept more than once in my show. The idea is, let's say that you like Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Easy enough thing, right? Now let's say you go without Reese's Peanut Butter Cups for a while. And let's say someone walks up and says, here's a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, and you like it. That's the effect I'm referring to right now. The distance makes you more inclined to like the same thing. Now, if you're probably saying, like, I don't understand. Why do I have to have that distance? Well, now assume the opposite for a moment. Imagine if someone was offering you a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup every day, just constantly, nonstop. Not only would your enjoyment of that automatically lower, it might get to the point where you actually get sick of it. It's the same thing, after all. And even though you liked it, you don't like it in excess. Too much of anything being a bad thing and all that. So, we liked Alien. We liked Aliens. And I would argue we haven't really had a good application of either of those two original story models since those movies up until this game. Now, the AVP series, that's different. They've done some stuff along those lines, and there's some other things that have done some stuff with the xenomorphs in general. But in the Aliens franchise itself, I personally would argue, and I'm not trying to, lay down the law, but this is just my opinion on the matter. I would state that the last time we saw good applications of those two stories was in Alien 1 and in Aliens 2. So we see those two things coming back forth into this game, and we like it again, because we haven't had a Reese's in a few years. You understand the analogy now? And they fully embrace it, too. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's actually the point I want to end on. But they fully embrace that this is a alien game. That they're basically making a game based off of Alien, the first movie. But rather than literally making a game based, in the movie, like you would usually see, they make a game in full inspired by the movie. This is actually something I've talked about recently. I don't remember if it was on Voyager or Babylon 5. It's something I've talked about somewhat recently, and that should be videos coming live this month. The idea... Oh, right, it was the episode Blink in Time or something like that. Blink of an Eye. Blink of an Eye. Over on Voyager is when I was talking about it. The idea that they didn't just copy-paste the movie Alien. They watched the movie Alien. They studied it. They got beats down in terms of directing, in terms of how shots are shown, in terms of how events lay out, in terms of the graphical aesthetic of how things are happening, in terms of the audio aesthetic, in terms of the structure of the character dynamics. You know, a lot of things, they really analyzed that first movie and said, okay, we're going to try and implement that in a game. But they didn't just make Alien the game. They made a new thing, something of their own thing, inspired by. So it's the second category, inspired by the Alien movie and the Alien franchise. And I really like that. I think that's one of the reasons this game is awesome. By the way, I recommend this game. For those of you not even aware of me or my stuff, I'm not a fan of horror stuff. I never really have been. The exceptions are the truly rare exceptions, and this is one of them. And I think probably part of that is because of the fact that it has a smart story underneath it. It's not super complicated. It isn't completely full with pathos or drama or in-depth characterization or whatnot, things that I usually eat up. But it is a smart story. What we see here is an Alien game, an Alien anything, which does not feature Weyland-Yutani as the omnipresent villain. Now, obviously, if you've played this game, you're looking at me kind of weird, because Weyland-Yutani absolutely has a presence. But let me explain what I mean by that. Instead, what we see is the Seegson Corporation and Ransom. Remember him? Oh, you probably don't, actually. It's actually kind of funny, because Ransom himself was a spiteful, selfish, petty, small fish in a big pond kind of a character who is illustrated. His character is illustrated in kind of a meta sense as well, because you never, not counting the DLC, you never really see him on camera. All you have is his audio logs to flesh out his character. He is the corrupt executive. He is your typical evil, greedy, selfish suit character who has been completely screwing over the place to the point of criminal negligence in order to try and pocket as much cash as he can for himself and for no one else, at the actual expense of literal safety, again, for himself and others. He actually gets attacked by one of the frickin' Joes, for God's sakes. And we see that Joe in his office. But, so he fills that role of the suit. And then we have the our good friend Marshall Waits. He was a nice touch as well. He was your typical military kind of guy, but except for the fact that he wasn't. He's our first variation off of the norm, because rather than being your completely stereotypical idiot, he was a well-meaning individual who was actually trying to make things better and actually trying to be an assistant, an aid in the overall process, who kind of went completely south with that because he was simply in so far over his head. It's kind of the equivalent of the old trope where, you know, a small town has a big murder, and the local cop who's used to dealing with people who are vagrants or, you know, people who cross the street at the wrong stoplight or are not at a stoplight, you know. He's used to, that cop is used to dealing with those kind of a people. And all of a sudden, you know, a mass murderer shows up in town and he has no idea how to deal with it. That's how he is portrayed. And he does absolutely make things worse, but not by flat-out incompetence, not by being an idiot, and not by deliberate malevolence. He is simply someone who is inexperienced, someone who cannot keep up with the threat that he is facing. And then we see Taylor. Taylor's probably my favorite of these things. I only really have much to say about these three characters, so if you're wondering, those are the only three I'm going to cover. Taylor was very interesting because... Well, actually, I want to talk about Samuel really quick. I've changed my mind. I want to talk about Samuel very briefly. Because Samuel was an android, and let's be honest, the androids being bad guys is a very common thing in this setting, in this franchise. The synthetic, excuse me. Because as we all know, it was at least originally intended that Blade Runner and the Alien franchise, and therefore, by continuation, the Alien versus Predator franchise, would all exist within the same continuity, the same setting. But regardless, it's very, very common for these synthetics to be portrayed as the bad guys. And again, there's, of course, the Joes all over the place, which are naturally bad guys, so to speak, who you have to contend with on a regular basis, especially after you get rid of the first xenomorph. But the presentation of Samuel as someone who clearly does not agree with his overriding directive, which we don't find out until later, and his overall interest in the main character, Amanda, is interesting to me in many ways. I think they literally did that just to curb expectations, But at the same time, that's kind of the theme of most of the characters in this work in general, curbing expectations. Most of them play against type, which, of course, naturally brings me to the biggest example of that, which is Taylor, the executive, the Weyland-Yutani executive. Now, if I tell you right now, Weyland-Yutani executive, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? They are so stupid evil that they have actually been in contest with a corporation some of you may be aware of called Umbrella Corps. That there have been discussions I've had, and I know some of you have had, heck, I've had some of these with you, but I'm sure some of you have had them amongst yourselves and your friends, about who's the more stupid evil company. Because both Weyland-Yutani and Umbrella Corp are ridiculously evil and stupid. But not just evil and stupid, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. Stupid evil. Just absolutely morally bankrupt and being a moron while doing it. Weyland-Yutani excels at that. So seeing that Taylor is actually a decent person who has a brain, and as soon as she realizes the reality of the situation, she's on your side, that was nice. And honestly, I'm going to be completely blunt, that did catch me by surprise. I was really surprised by that. And then the fact... So we've got Taylor having a brain, we've got Samuels being a good guy, and then we've got the big reveal. There are... several big reveals in this, but I think this is the biggest one from a pure story perspective. The fact that Weyland-Yutani is behind all of these events. That reveal would not have worked if basically the whole first half of the game hadn't been working so hard to convince you that it was not Weyland-Yutani that was behind everything. And again, showing Taylor in a different light, showing Samuel in a different light, playing everything against expectation, only to then play something exactly as expected, thereby giving it the power of a twist, even though it is actually an untwist. And I've talked about this concept many times. For those of you not aware, an untwist is when you think there's going to be some big twist, and in fact it's exactly what's expected. And that's exactly what happens. We've got the twist with Taylor, the twist with Samuels, the twist with Ransom, and then finally the untwist with Weyland-Yutani. And it was actually them behind this the whole time. They bought the station 2 weeks ago and have been giving orders to Apollo this whole time. You know, that whole thing. It also explained... I call that the big twist because of its untwist nature, but also because it informs almost everything that's been happening. That's another thing this game does very well. You, the character, basically make everything worse several times. Probably the best example of this, there's two, actually, two good examples of this, and they show this in gameplay and story integration. Great example of gameplay story integration, is when you successfully eject the one xenomorph, right? I should say the one, because it's heavily implied that you aren't actually just interacting with one, that there are several scouts out and roaming, which helps to explain how they're able to keep track of you and all that fun stuff. But anyways, so you eject the one, and at that point Apollo decides, alright, based on my programming and the fact that maintaining the xenomorph is more important than anything else, including the humans on the station, humans have just been classified as a threat to the xenomorph. That's when the Joes go crazy and start killing everybody. And that sounds like a weird intro to a G.I. Joe storyline, doesn't it? And then the Joes go crazy and start killing everyone. But that you cause that. You do that. I mean, granted, you're working with Jackass. I'm not even going to talk about it. There's nothing really worth talking about with him, I don't think. You're working with Jackass in order to do that, but still, you, the player, did that. And then, later on, you go to the Hive. Again, wonderful scene when you see the Hive. You, the player, and you, the character, Amanda, both have a unique perspective on understanding just how completely screwed you are once you see that Hive. And that buys back into that dread thing I mentioned. You know what's coming and you can't do anything about it. That's kind of that dread. And so then you take on the Hive, and now they've got to make that second Hive, and now they need more people to make more aliens. So then they start sending out the facehuggers. That's when you start encountering facehuggers in the game. And that's how Ricardo ends up going as well, because you did that. You released the facehuggers. You caused them to do that. I like that. There's one other thing I want to talk about. I haven't really talked about this much because, again, I haven't really talked about the Alien franchise as a whole. I want to talk about the aesthetic. It's sometimes referred to as a combination of Z-Rust and lived in. I have talked about this concept before when I've talked about Star Wars. One of the things that Star Wars does very, very well is it makes everything feel much more believable. And it does it in the same way here, but I want to talk about it more here. I only touched on it briefly there. Because It's all about making it more familiar. I've talked many, many times about the familiarity effect and how it affects us and our enjoyment of a fictional work. Again, for those of you if you're just joining me the first time, the way the familiarity effect works is you tend to enjoy things more if they are more familiar to you. You may like Civilization. Take your pick. I'll use Civilization 5 as an example. You may like Civilization 5, but a Civilization 5 map done in the style of Azeroth or of the real world or of, I don't know, there's the Guild Wars world. I can't think of the name of it all of a sudden. You're more inclined to like one of those maps than you are just a randomly generated map because it's familiar to you. You recognize it. You see everything in it. I've talked about this many, many times in my work. And what this lived-in feel does, the fact that everything has just a bit of soot on it and looks like it's not polished to a sheen, it looks like people are constantly using it, and misusing it in some cases, poorly maintained in other cases, there's all these tiny little details, hundreds and hundreds of tiny, tiny, tiny little details that are all combined to make it all look familiar. They want it to look just like things that you see in your everyday real life. When you go into town, you go into the city, or you're going to the bus stop, you're going to the restaurant, you're going to the school, or wherever it is you go, you see things like scuffs on the sidewalk, or cracks in the street. All these little details that make it, that we know are an aspect of real life. They put those artificially in the game or in the book or in the movie, in this case the game obviously, to make it more familiar. And that adds a critical element of believability to the work. We're technically dealing with a setting that's actually very high concept. It's got faster-than-light travel, functional working synthetic androids who have near-perfect AI. It's got the xenomorphs themselves, which just contrast so much of what we understand about physiology and biology. It's got the predators, for God's sakes, who have their own thing going on. All these high-concept things exist in this setting, and yet I bet if I were to ask you right now, or more accurately a few minutes ago before I started this whole spiel, if you think the Alien franchise, the Alien setting, if you will, is, high tier or low tier, in other words, hard science or soft science, or I'm saying that wrong. Soft science would be up here and high science would be down here. Hard science would be down here. You'd probably be more likely to say hard science. You'd probably be more likely to say it's more believable. It's more down to earth is another term that's often used to describe what I'm talking about here. And it's all because of that lived-in nature and feel of things. Even the pulse guns they use, which fire steel-encased explosive-tipped rounds of doom, which are death guns walking, nevertheless look and feel very much like machine guns we could see in automatic machine guns we see in real life. That aesthetic is very, very important, especially for a horror thing, game or movie. Because now, that familiarity effect makes it feel like someplace we might actually go to. That believability is so important to add that extra layer of, well, let's just call it what it is, fear. How could you be so afraid to be in anywhere in this place if you don't actually have the possibility of believing you could be there? It's not realistic. I've talked many times about the difference between realism and believability, but it is very believable and very self-cohesive. And this brings me to my final point about this game. The gameplay. I know that sounds weird. Oftentimes I don't even discuss gameplay in some of these ruminations. This is not a review after all. But in this case, the gameplay is in most ways the story. Obviously, they do some smart stuff with regards to the script. I've already talked about that. Obviously, they try to, bring us a Reese's, even though it's been a while. I've talked about that. But the gameplay is how the story of this game works. It's almost, with two tiny exceptions, this game is entirely first person from the perspective of Amanda Ripley. I've said before that the usage of first person as a narrative tool is something too few games actually utilize. I actually like to prefer to Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, as one of my favorite examples of a game that actually uses first person perspective as a storytelling tool. It's not the only one, but it's one of my favorite examples, go-to examples, A, because a lot of people have played it, but B, because it's such a great example of that concept. This game is another one I'm going to start adding to the list because it does the exact same thing. And there's so much. I wish I could just... It's hard to explain it because it's a full sensory experience. If you're going to play this game, play it with headphones. I'm serious. You will get so much more, unless you have like a really kick-ass speaker system, in which case, by all means, go for it. I don't. I have like my two little, speakers, but play it with headphones. You will understand so much why I say that when you play this game. There is so much ambiance, there's so much sound, there's so many little tiny details in every aspect of the game, audio and visual, with and it pulls off something that Doom 3 tried and failed at. Doom 3 tried for horror through jump scares and through bad lighting. Here, it actually uses good lighting. It's still dark. You still have the difficulty of seeing where you're going and what you're doing, but there are appropriate flashes here or there, and they're frequent enough that you do actually have an idea of where you're seeing. You can see where you're going. It's just you understand just how horrible it actually is. You see where I'm going. There is a difference between good lighting and bad lighting when it comes to that kind of dark thing. Furthermore, this game does not rely very much on jump scares. I actually went so far as to have a not quite argument. It was a discussion. It was a heated discussion, but it didn't actually reach into the argument level with a friend of mine recently about jump scares. I was giving the point that I personally feel jump scares shouldn't be a thing. Like, the application of a jump scare, as I define it, is something that is always a negative. To define that really quick, because you're probably wondering what I'm talking about. In my definition, a jump scare is an unexpected wah moment that's intended to make you jump, and nothing else. There have been other usages of wah in movies and games and books and whatnot. Well, books it's hard to do, but it has been done. In television, which are not intended to make you jump. They're intended to serve some other purpose. And I'm not going to go into examples right now. But my point is, this game doesn't really rely on, this is not Five Nights at Freddy's, for God's sakes. This is an absolutely terrifying, dreadful piece of atmosphere. The lighting, the visuals, the audio. One of my favorite little touches is the fact that the alien can hear the beeping on your motion sensor. Think about that for a moment. Your greatest tool, your most powerful implement for telling where the alien is at any given point in time, also tells it where you are. And if that's not an analogy for this franchise as a whole, I don't know what is. Also, as a further aside, the game does allow you to turn down the difficulty in mid-game, which I think was a good move. The higher difficulties are pretty darn brutal. Basically, the 1 HP thing on the higher difficulty, and the fact that your motion sensor basically doesn't work, and a few other things like not being able to find resources and whatnot. But that atmosphere, the game just oozes atmosphere. There's actually a few sections of this game I replayed just because I wanted to experience the moment again. The destruction of the reactor with Taylor's death, the discovery of the hive, and pretty much the entire finale are big examples that come to mind immediately, because holy crap. Furthermore, on top of that, is the fact that, how do I put this? The game allows you to decide your own experience. The concept of so many people talk about emergent gaming. They use it as a buzzword. And so many people toss that out there as a thing. It has always been my opinion, and it's nice to see it validated in this game, that emergent gaming only works when it's affixed to a strong skeleton. That, in other words, there is a core central flow of both narrative and goals that then the emergent gaming can rotate around, rather than just being plopped down into a giant sandbox and being told to go. Now, it is worth noting that I don't like giant sandboxes with no direction. I've talked about this before, the gradient scale between completely linear gameplay and completely sandbox gameplay. I prefer something more in the middle. But this does exactly that. This is an emergent game. This is a sandboxy style game. It even has some Metroidvania elements to it, with regards to finding the right tools in order to progress to different areas, blah, blah, blah. And so it hits a nice sweet spot there in the in-between, because you do have goals, you do have a direction, you are trying to actually do stuff, but the odds of you having the same experience on a second playthrough are virtually non-existent because of the fact that the obstacle which you are proceeding past literally learns as you do and adapts to you and to your tactics. And I love that. Now, there are some silly things, and there are some natures in which the AI just doesn't know how to function properly or how to deal with something properly. Probably one thing that actually made me burst out laughing is at one point in time the alien just dropped down right in front of me, but then did nothing. I thought I was dead. I actually took my hands off the keyboard, and then he's just like, no, he just walks off, and I'm like, and I walk out, and I'm like, and like, I don't know why, but he just ignored my presence entirely. There was no distraction nearby, you know, no survivors, no Joes or anything like that. He was just, nope, I'm just walking through, and I'm like, I'm right here. You can, okay, you don't have to kill me, that's okay. But then there's other times, and they use things that wouldn't have worked if this was our first introduction into the Alien franchise. They use the drool, they use the clattering, they use the beeping of the motion sensor. They use all these little things that are audio and visual iconic aspects to the Alien franchise, so that those of us who know what to expect know what it means. It's the Jaws effect, actually. Jaws the shark wasn't that terrifying. It was a broken piece of crap that barely worked right. The physical device, I mean, that they used to implement Jaws. It was the things that implied Jaws that had impact. When you saw that barrel being dragged along, when you saw the waves being turned, when you saw the fin, you knew what that meant, and that was the horrifying part. When you see that drool dripping down, when you see the skitter, or hear the skittering through the ducts, you know what that means. And that's the horrifying part. There's actually, this game is astonishingly light on gore, given its subject matter, and I actually really like that. I'm sorry I don't have much more to say. I have nothing but praise for this game. But unfortunately, there's not much more to discuss, at least not in my opinion, so I hope you've at least enjoyed. And I'll see you next time.